Hello there, this is Jay Frost. Welcome to another edition of Frontlines for Social Good. And today we're going to begin with some news, and there's a lot of it, followed by conversations with two special guests on the shifting political landscape, the role of leadership in nonprofits, and a look at an agency under fire. First, a little bit of news. A recent survey by the Conference Board is shedding light on changing priorities in corporate America. Andrew Jones, senior ESG researcher at the Conference Board, says many companies are broadening their initiatives toward economic opportunity and education while dialing back programs explicitly tied to race and gender. He says these findings signal a shift, not a retreat, in advancing gender and racial equality. Companies are incorporating these goals into broader frameworks like workforce development, technical trainings, and financial empowerment that better align with their core business priorities. In a commentary for Forbes, Tim McClyman, who has been in the series before, highlights that most corporations surveyed still maintain long-term strategic goals despite emerging political pressures. As McClyman says, while the social, political, and regulatory landscape in the U.S. is shifting, in 2025, under a new administration in Congress, 53% of surveyed corporate citizenship leaders anticipate no tangible impact on their resources or budgets for the year. However, about 1/5 of respondents foresee a greater emphasis on cost efficiency and aligning philanthropic efforts with shareholder value. In news on giving around the world, first we begin with a story from Scotland. Across the Atlantic, the Glasgow Times is reporting that 9 museums in Scotland, including the soon-to-open Clydebank Museum, have been awarded a share of £456,000 from Museum Galleries Scotland, with support from the Scottish government, to enhance community engagement. This is an important story also because soon we'll be following what changes, if any, there will be in US funding for the arts. West Dunbartonshire's Council Museum Service received £25,000 and change for its Connecting Clydebank Communities and Culture project, focused on highlighting Clydebank's heritage through art and cultural programming. Local councillors emphasized that the project aims to permanently showcase Clydebank's collections and create more opportunities for public participation in the region's history. Now we have a quick philanthropic roundup. First, Roots Community Health has received $1 million in a lead gift from BMO US, bringing its Roots for Youth campaign total to $2 million. Kemptville District Hospital Foundation has secured $2.3 million for a new CT scanner. NCH Hospital, for special surgery, has reached its $20 million matching gift target. And Tufts University's Friedman School of Nutrition and Science received an historic $10 million gift for financial aid, according to Newswise. A new $5 million Bankovich Fund for Community Investment was established at Mount Nittany Health. Eli Lilly and Company has donated $11 million to Howard University for student scholarships. And Gwynedd Mercy University has received a 7-figure gift for its Francis McGuire 55 Healthcare Innovation Center. We also see that there's an undisclosed amount, but a transformational gift that's been made to Cambridge University for a professorship in young people's mental health. There is a news story coming out of Wisconsin. Embezzlement allegations have been levied against a former vice president at Madison's Goodman Community Center, who now faces felony charges for allegedly embezzling more than $600,000 to fund gambling and personal expenses, according to a criminal complaint filed in Dane County. Dwayne Powell, age 42, is charged with multiple accounts, including uttering a forgery and theft of movable property. According to Channel 3000's Kyle Jones, Powell was terminated last June after suspicious checks were flagged by the center's bank. And an audit later uncovered alleged misuse of center credit cards for gambling, rent, and frequent Venmo payments to relatives. The Powell is due in court on these charges on February 27th. There's a major leadership change occurring at TED. TED, which is famous, of course, for its TED Talks and regional TEDx events. The founder has announced that he is searching for a new leader after 25 years. The leader, of course, has been Chris Anderson, author of a book on generosity released just last year. And Anderson plans to gift the organization to a new steward, as he describes it, who can chart TED's future. In an open letter, Anderson wrote that the nonprofit success owes much to letting go and encourages prospective stewards to submit proposals for TED's next chapter. Any purchase amount would go toward TED's continued growth, sustaining the global platform that has given rise to programs like TEDx, TED-Ed, and TED Democracy. There's more information on that, which we will try to include in the show notes in case you or others you know would like to be an eligible steward for TED into the future. Now we turn to a very, very important story. 10 days into his new term, President Trump has issued a number of executive orders and actions, some of which have a direct impact on higher education and are putting higher education administrators on edge. These measures range from redefining gender under federal law to limiting diversity initiatives and reversing immigration protections. And here to break down the impact on colleges and universities, we have Jessica Blake, policy reporter inside Higher Ed and author of an article which I urge you to read, 10 Days In, What Actions Has Trump Taken? Jessica, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely, Jay. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to get to kind of walk back through. Everything's been moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour, so it's nice to have a second to pause and reflect and walk through everything again.
Well, and I know for many people, this is coming as very fresh news. They haven't been following it like you have. So maybe you can begin by just telling us about what brought you to this article, why Insider Higher Ed is covering it, and what's its importance.
Sure. So just a little bit about Inside Higher Ed. We are an industry-focused publication, so most of our readers tend to be faculty and administrators, state lawmakers who focus on education, and our job is to cover day in and day out what's happening in the world of academia for them. And so, of course, we have been following anything since Inauguration Day that has to do with higher education, whether directly or tangentially. That has been executed by the Trump administration and or on the Hill, and there has been a lot of it. And so we hit the end of week 2, and the thought was initially, it's time. There's been so much that's happened that we in the newsroom, people who are covering it every day, are struggling to keep track of things. It might be good to find one place where we can fit it all and kind of summarize it for other people who can't be keeping up with this day in and day out. And so that's hopefully what this article is, if you get the chance to read it. Gives you a pretty good summary of what happened in the first 10 days, and then has a bunch of links out to more in-depth explanations if there are particular issues that you're interested in.
For those who are with us live, there is a link in the chat, but we're also going to include that in the show notes. The article goes over lots of material. And before we get into some of the topics that you cover, how many orders or actions did you have to review in order to have a sense about the scope and the magnitude of what has been covered by these events?
Yeah, so there are lots and lots of executive orders. There were a historic number of executive orders signed on his first day in office. There's lots of them that will have some impact on higher education. It's one of the reasons I love higher education and covering it. We call it, in some ways, the liberal arts beat of journalism, because just like a liberal arts education, there are so many different things that higher ed is connected to finance, to athletics, to all of the different aspects. So there's a lot of executive orders that could touch to higher ed to some degree, but I think there are 3 key ones that we're keeping a really close eye on, executive order-wise, at least, for higher ed. One has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. One has to do with defining sex and gender identity, and one has to do with anti-Semitism. And then there's also a collection of legislation on the Hill, orders that have to do with immigration, that kind of creates a 4th category that is impacting college campuses, particularly that they took away college campuses and churches as a safe zone where ICE agents ICE agents historically have not been allowed to make detentions in those spaces, and they are now. So that's kind of one of those. So those 4 areas are where we're really paying attention to start, I'd say.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about college campuses as being in the same category as public schools, where people just don't enter. So colleges have also been kind of a safe space for people from immigration enforcement historically.
Yeah, it can be a little bit more nuanced just because if you think of the nature of a college campus, it's not as much of close, unless you're talking about a college campus like Columbia in Manhattan, where they quite literally have walls up around the campus. A lot of campuses are free and open public spaces. So it gets a little bit more nuanced, but it still is going to provide challenges to colleges and universities in ways that they haven't experienced before because they were under the same umbrella as K through 12 schools when it came to protection in those facets.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good point to dive into immigration as one of those key topics, because Colombia, for many of us, has been at the center of news coverage since there was a large movement among students around the country last year. People will remember protests concerning Gaza,
Yeah.
and lots of back and forth with it, and then hearings on the Hill. So
Yep.
I don't know how much of the background you wish to go into, but can you give us kind of an analysis about maybe the background for the order, and then what the order might be indicating to colleges and universities that are trying to navigate this?
Sure. So the anti-Semitism order, which came out last week, I believe it was Wednesday, but that's testing my mind there. So be sure to fact check me on that date. But believe that one came out last Wednesday. I think one of the things that's important to note across the board for the Trump administration's orders thus far is that there are a lot of questions that are unanswered. The orders themselves are oftentimes very broad and have vague language. Actually, that vague language has come up to just yesterday evening. A lawsuit was filed about the diversity, equity, and inclusion order. And what part of the argument that the plaintiffs are making is that the language is so vague and they never even define DEI in the order. And so how can you know what is and isn't allowed if there's not even a definition? So same applies to this anti-Semitism order. There are a lot of aspects of it that are broad and pretty vague. And so some of what the impact will depend on how the agencies choose to execute the order. And so some of that we will be waiting to see as days and weeks unfold. But I think broadly, we can look at four key things that the anti-Semitism order is doing. The most shocking to experts in higher education that we spoke with, one of them involves bringing in the Department of Justice to respond to complaints of anti-Semitism and ethnic discrimination on campus, which is historically not the case. It's typically been the Department of Education and their Office of Civil Rights that's handled these things. Therefore, it's a civic case, it's a civil case rather than a criminal case. Bringing in the Department of Justice introduces a whole new level of potential criminal charges that could be at play. So that's one element. Another element, kind of extending on that, is tying this anti-Semitism also to the immigration status and priorities of the Trump administration, and saying that if there are any students or scholars on campus who are involved in protests that are deemed anti-Semitic, that they could then not only be criminally charged, but as someone here on a visa with that criminal charge could be deported, which is really potentially chilling to free speech on college campuses. So that's something we're paying attention to. And then the other two were a little bit more expected. One of them defines anti-Semitism, reaffirms the Trump administration's definition of anti-Semitism in the same way they did during the first administration. And the second focuses on just helping to redirect some of the given guidance for how the Department of Education will handle cases that are ongoing currently for complaints that were filed previously.
I know that Congress also made an effort to define anti-Semitism
Yeah.
during the Biden administration. So is there a parallel between that definition as you read it and the one that the Trump administration now is
Yes.
applying to this?
Yep. So it is, I don't believe that the legislation that was trying to be passed on the Hill actually made it through. That would have, this is something that we see constantly. There's been a lot of push and pull lately as administrations on the executive branch side have changed between parties back and forth. We call it a swinging pendulum of regulation. And so regulations are coming in and going out, and that's part of what makes this impactful for all kinds of institutions is that they're constantly having to adapt. But anytime that it's happening at the regulatory level through the executive agencies, it's not quite as firm and lasting as if it were to be legislation on the Hill. And so, to my understanding, there was no legislation on the Hill passed that was defining anti-Semitism, but the core concept of the legislation that was proposed and the regulations that are going to be enforced by the Trump administration are the same. The definition comes from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. There's controversy, and it can be a pretty polarizing definition because sometimes it includes examples of anti-Semitism discrimination that are judged based on whether or not you're critiquing the Israeli government, if that goes against Zionist perspectives, and if that is anti-Semitism is a debated topic. And so that's going to be something that is really up for question for colleges and universities is what does count and what doesn't count under this very much contested and polarized definition.
And to go back to your point about DEI, it's probably a good transition to that. There's a definition with anti-Semitism that is being applied by this administration, however one chooses to view it, but there is a definition at play. But it sounds like there is not one for DEI.
Yeah, so the DEI order broadly refers to DEI and DEIA, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, but it never explicitly defines either. And so the lawsuit that was introduced yesterday evening by the American Association of University Professors, as well as an association of diversity officers from colleges and universities, as well as a couple other organizations, but on the higher ed side, those are the main players. This lawsuit argues that based on that vagueness and lack of definition in the order, that it's a violation of the Fifth Amendment and of due process, because if they don't know what they are potentially being charged, could be charged for, going against exactly what DEI is, how can they know how to work around it? So that's a story that I'm actively reporting on today. So still getting legal scholars and experts to comment on what the standing of that argument is going to be. But that's the argument that they're making is DEI doesn't have a definition in this order. You're telling us we have to get rid of DEI, but what exactly is DEI that we have to get rid of? So that's one that, again, there are oftentimes with these orders, lots more questions than there are answers.
I know it's a story in development for you. But as you're talking with institutions, this lack of definition, it must be a major issue for them. What kinds of things are you hearing in terms of the response to this lack of definition, but a very, very clear executive order?
Yeah, so I think across the board with all four of the orders that we have been talking about and looking at, because there are these broad messages that the Trump administration is putting forward, but not always the fine details. A lot of the orders also include a commission for the secretary of the department to create a plan for how to execute this order. And so until you have that plan, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. Until you have definitions, you don't know exactly what it means. And all of that across the board, while there's this clear overarching message, when you don't know the details, it's causing a lot of confusion. So what we're tending to hear from the lobbyist groups that we're talking to, from the administrators that we're talking to on the ground, is there is a lot of confusion, and the confusion creates chaos. And the chaos in many ways is creating chilling effects to campus programs, to free speech on campus, and that those are real concerns. So it's this fine line that everybody's trying to walk of acknowledging the real concerns that are there, but also not being too alarmist without knowing the details and how it's going to be enacted, these orders, that they are making decisions that they don't have to early on. So there are some places that have taken preemptive actions trying to respond to these orders, and there are other places that are trying to say, whoa, hold your horses. Let's try and wait this out and see if they're actually going to pressure on these ideas that they are saying in the orders. And let's see how that goes before we make any real actions ourselves on campus.
Just a quick follow-up on that and the reactions that you're hearing. I attended a meeting hosted by a fundraising consultant and featuring a number of different nonprofits, many of them quite small, so outside of higher education yesterday. And one of the things that I heard from several of these organizations, and this was all in a private meeting, is that several of them were doing what they described as scrubbing their websites to ensure that the language did not expose them to risk. They didn't see themselves as changing their program or their commitments to their constituents, but that they were changing the language so as not to run afoul of potential interpretations of this. So I know that that's small nonprofits are not the same thing as major universities. There are different risks and different elements at play. But are you hearing that some organizations are essentially changing the way they characterize their work in order to at least weather this storm until there's a little more guidance?
Yeah, we have definitely seen some of that. And I mean, I think it's important to note that these executive orders from the Trump administration are not the beginning of this. A lot of these messages that have been put out through the Trump administration's executive orders are key issues that the GOP has been pushing for a while now. And so particularly in red dominated states, some of these things have been showing up in executive orders from governors, in state legislation for a while now. So for example, with the DEI, there are numerous states that have passed state legislation banning DEI programs in public schools, on public college campuses, et cetera. And so some of those states, you have seen colleges trying to get ahead once this legislation has been proposed and trying to reframe their DEI experiences to belonging centers, or there's different ways of trying to name these things. And so we've seen that certainly even in the months and years before Trump was inaugurated into office for the second time. But then we're also seeing them since these federal orders have come out. We are seeing some colleges and universities that are working to try and keep the programs as much as possible, but rename them or reframe them in order to avoid any pushback.
Let's dive into gender. What are you hearing on the gender front here, and is it specific to transgender issues, which have been a political football in the last election season, or are they also encompassing Title IX, for example?
Yeah, so it definitely impacts Title IX. It definitely impacts transgender student protections, transgender student athletes, and their ability to participate in college athletics. Again, it's frustrating at times, but oftentimes the answer that we have is that there are more questions and we will have to see how this plays out. So it is very similar in that area. This is one that is, I mean, we're going to see the real impacts on Title IX, but some of it also is influenced by, it would be an even bigger deal if the Biden administration had tried to pass its own Title IX policies that were more protective for transgender students, for LGBTQ students, for students who are pregnant while in college. That attempt at Title IX was blocked by courts. And so then that meant that we instantly reverted back to the 2020 Title IX regulations that the first Trump administration had put through. And so some of the questions are a little bit less contentious because the Trump administration already has their Title IX policies in place, but there are still other aspects that this order goes past what that first Title IX regulation had done. And so we don't know exactly what that will mean for colleges and universities yet.
As you're talking about this, I'm remembering that one of the agencies which is under a certain amount of pressure now is reported to be the Department of Education. And the question is, of course, what if there is a change there, or if there is a pause in their administration or funding of different activities, if that will have an impact on lots of different things across the country. Is that one of the things that you're beginning to research and talk with people about, is the Department of Education and funding disbursements from education, or their oversight role with colleges and universities?
Yeah, absolutely. So you brought up funding halts and funding freezes, which have happened across the board. That also is referenced if you're looking for a breakdown on that. We referenced that in our 10 days overview article. So feel free to take a look at the link for that. It is impacting the Department of Education for sure. That freeze on federal grants that was a topic of discussion at the beginning of last week the memo has since been rescinded. It has been blocked in court. So currently there is no freeze on federal grants, but there were federal grants within the Department of Education that were absolutely under fire when that freeze came out initially. And the Trump administration, it is important to note, while they have rescinded the original memo and while it is blocked in court in multiple different cases, they are still proceeding with the comprehensive analysis piece that they had talked about in that first memo. So not only had they instructed the agencies to freeze any federal grants that did not go directly to individuals, they also said conduct a comprehensive analysis of all of your grant programs to tell us if there are any that might go against any of the Trump executive orders that have been put out so far. And those analyses are still going on. So they have made a point to say, we are going to continue to push to potentially retract some of these grants, redirect where their dollars are going, et cetera. So there's still a lot to be determined in that area as well. And on top of that, those federal grant freezes that are impacting all departments, there have been discussions of looking to dismantle the Department of Education as a whole. Similar to what happened with USAID earlier this week, there have been discussions about trying to dismantle and halt the Department of Education's function entirely. That is a whole different beast because that requires legislative action. Because the department is written into statute, it would require legislation from the Hill to get rid of the Department of Education entirely. But there are other ways that the Trump administration, without that legislation, can shrink the size of the Department of Education by letting go of long-term career staffers, by changing and shifting projects to other agencies. So there's a lot of ways that the Department of Education is up for discussion currently.
As you're having these discussions with people, I know you have a variety of sources that you're accessing in order to understand the dimensions of this. Are there some leaders in the sector that are emerging in the same way that the National Center for Nonprofits, with its lawsuit, took aim at the funding freeze and then pause? Are there people within specifically the higher education realm that are beginning to advise and coordinate activities to help at least guide educational institutions in how to respond to some of these changes?
Sure, there are always key voices, even not in times like this, that are leaders within the sphere of higher education. Some of the voices that we talk to often, the American Association for University Professors, which I mentioned earlier and is involved in the lawsuit against the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Order. They're a key voice. They have put out statements really urging colleges and universities not to take preemptive actions in response to these orders and to stand firm and stand their ground and see how things play out. So that's one voice that we've been looking at. The American Council on Education is also a key player. They are a lobbyist group representing higher education institutions. There are some folks that we are oftentimes listening to. Same with the Association for Public Land Grant Universities. They are specifically focused on land grant institutions, public institutions, whereas ACE is a little bit more broad, but they're a voice that we're listening to. So there are definitely key players that are always giving us updates, are able to help with what we know, analyze what is this going to mean for colleges and universities. So yeah, there's definitely key players in the game.
I can't imagine what it's like to try and track all these stories. It must be a tough job. Which are the ones that you're focused most on as you look forward? I know that you have to be dynamic. There may be new things coming from the White House, from Congress, from across the country, but which ones are you following most closely right now?
I mean, we're trying to follow them all as closely as we can. So it's a hard question to answer just because, like you said, in many ways, it depends on a day-to-day basis. It is the nature of journalism that I walk into the newsroom in the morning and say, okay, what's on the table today? And oftentimes that will switch midway through the day. So I wouldn't put it as which ones in which particular issues are we paying closest attention to, but I'd just say we are trying to pay close attention to And it will change more and more as the weeks goes on. From initially it was, what are these orders that are coming out? Can we just get the basics on what they say? And now we're starting to shift more to, what is this going to mean? And how are people responding? And so that's what we're going to be looking at more and more, is what this is meaning when it comes to universities, especially as there's been challenges with state funding for higher education lately, depend more and more on donors, on philanthropy work. So what is the impact that it's having there? We'll look at what is the impact that it's having on students on the ground. What are faculty members talking about how it's changing the way that they approach lectures in the classroom. So shifting more from what has been put out there to, what does this mean and what is the impact, is how I'd focus on it. And that's where our attention is starting to shift. But again, new things are coming out each day. So it's kind of always going to be a mix of what is happening and then what does this mean.
Thank you for all of this. We'll definitely keep following, because you're following it so closely. We'll be following your work inside higher ed. Really appreciate it. Jessica Blake, thank you so much for sharing with us today. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me.
And now we're going to shift gears a little bit, but there is always a connective tissue between the news stories of the day, but also what we can learn from people who've been doing this work for a long period of time, or found new ways to execute in challenging environments. And we certainly have those things with our next guest, as we shift gears to our author segment, where we spotlight new voices in nonprofit leadership. And joining us today for that discussion is Haley Cooper, who is the co-founder of a nonprofit that built a peanut butter factory in Malawi. So that alone should get your attention. You can also follow her work in lots of different ways we'll be discussing in a bit. But her book is Sow, Grow, Lead: Strategies from Nonprofit Leaders, where Haley does, among other things, offers practical strategies for guiding teams, engaging communities, and driving long-term impact. And a time like this, Haley, I mean, there's a lot of challenges for leaders every day, but especially now. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for spending time here.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
And I know that many people haven't read your book yet, so we'll definitely make sure to include a link here, so that people can go and grab it. But for those who don't know your story, can you start by just telling us a little bit about how it all began? This whole idea about the peanut butter factory in Malawi. Where did that start?
Yeah, so I definitely did not think that that was going to be my career path. I graduated from college in 2011 with a degree in kinesiology, thought I wanted to be a registered dietitian. But shortly after I graduated, I was sitting in my parents' church at the time, and someone was on stage saying they were going to Malawi, Africa for that summer. And they were going on a 2 weeks missions trip. And this was in August of 2011, and I nudged my parents and I said, "Guess where I'm going this summer?" And they kind of looked at me like I was a little bit crazy, because while my family is very philanthropic locally here in California, they'd never really done anything abroad. And so I went on my first missions trip to Malawi with this organization called Why Malawi. And at the time, they were trying to end all malaria deaths for children under 5, by spraying the village huts, and also giving tents for the beds. But they still found that children under 5 were passing away because of malnutrition. So the leader of that original missions trip reached out to me and had heard about this ready-to-use therapeutic product, which is essentially a fortified peanut butter paste. And he said, this is the solution to end all deaths for children under 5, because they need the nutrition to be able to combat the disease. And so we got in contact with the original founder of this product, and they gave us the ingredients and what we needed to be able to start. I was living at home at the time. This was in March of 2012, and we started making peanut butter in my parents' kitchen with a KitchenAid mixer, and trying to test the product with what we had here in the US. And shortly, we started a 501(c)(3) based out of the US with operations in Malawi. So while I did not know anything about a nonprofit, I was quickly thrown into what a 501(c)(3) is, what bylaws are, how do you hire employees, what does that all look like? And in August of 2012, I moved to Malawi, Africa at the age of 24 to start the factory. And we were promised a factory in Nkoma, Malawi, which is it has one of the most well-known training hospitals in Malawi. And there's expats that go and students that go in and out. And that's where most of the doctors and nurses learn. And it is a very rural community. But we decided to put the peanut butter factory on the hospital property. But when we got there, it was like the factory was rubble. There was nothing there. And so we had to quickly build a factory. We brought over our own KitchenAid mixers and we started bottling peanut butter right there on site. And we quickly, and I'll talk about more of this later, how we evolved to more of a sustainable quality factory, but that was kind of my journey. I didn't really know what I was getting myself into at the age of 24. All I knew was this is what I wanted to do. I had that immediate yes, I will do it. And when I stepped down out of that airplane, and if you've ever been to Africa, it's like a 36-hour flight. Like it's not for the faint of heart. It's a very long travel. And I stepped down at age 24, thrown into leadership and nonprofit and learning how to navigate bureaucracy in a foreign country.
There's a lot to unpack in that we can learn from too. And so let's put a pin in that for a second. But can you talk a little bit about key leadership skills? I know that's a feature of your book. So what are the things that are most critical for nonprofit leaders that you learn from your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when I was there, I lived with in an apartment, but I was the only American there from our team. So I quickly became resourceful. While I didn't really have access to internet, I used what I could in the computer lab to do my research and also I would also say relationship building is key as well and building a network. There were some key people in country that worked for other organizations that we partnered with who helped me kind of navigate the healthcare system, and getting our place well known in that, and also navigating some of the government bureaucracy. So I would say resourcefulness, um, relationship building, self-awareness is key to understanding, in those tense moments when you feel confused, when you feel uncertain, like what is going on internally so that you can show up better. I would also say active listening. I went in, as I think a lot of people do, that we're going to do all this good and we're going to change the world, right? But I think actively listening to the community and what their needs are transforms programs. And then I think courage. Courage is really a big leadership skill to do the things. I don't know what the Brene Brown quote is, but it's about, fear. Courage isn't the absence of fear, right? Like, so there's a lot of fear in the work, especially now when Jessica was just talking about all the uncertainty, right? But having the courage to show up anyways.
No, this is really important because the obstacles you encounter, you have to find a way to negotiate with them, sometimes jumping over them or under them, or finding a way to work with them as they are. You just talked about bureaucracy a second ago as being one. What was the kind of bureaucratic stuff that you had to manage to negotiate or navigate that was important in being able to sustain this enterprise?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think, when you think about landing in a country trying to establish a nonprofit, you would have to go to the government first. But we actually had to go to the head chief of the village to ask if we could start this factory. And also the title of the company is PB&J. So there was the Jesus component where we were going to go evangelize to the chiefs in the villages, so we needed her approval. And so that was our first stop. It wasn't even to go to the government to say, and the health institute in Malawi to say, this is what we're going to do. We had to go to her and get her approval. So luckily she said yes. And she actually was the one that did our cutting ceremony and fully supported us, which helped us be able to get into the villages and have some more leeway in educating what we were trying to do. And then, it's just the trying to get meetings in the bureau in Malawi can be challenging. Sometimes you wait for hours. Sometimes the meetings didn't happen. Malawians always said they have time, Americans have watches. So we expect like we're going to be 5 minutes early. This meeting's going to happen on time, and maybe they'd show up 2 hours late, but it's still like that connection, right? So I think just pushing through some of those differences in cultures and traditions and how you operate was navigating those bureaucracies. And we had to move forward with getting our factory approved for widespread distribution, but it was a really slow process. I mean, in the scheme of things, it took 2 or 3 years, but which could be maybe fast, but it just was an ongoing process. So just navigating some of those cultural differences and how we can, again, through active listening and empathy, be able to move forward, to be able to do what we set out to do.
I didn't ask you this when we chatted informally before about the PB&J name, and again about the element, which is evangelism. And it sounds like with the village leader that you were able to to achieve that success and be welcomed. But do you have some learnings that you took from that experience that you think applied to other faith-based organizations? There are many who are trying to figure out how to navigate this kind of growth as well. They have an idea. An element of that is evangelism. And the question is, well, how can they make sure that they are welcomed where they go to do their work? What kind of things did you learn through this process that you think might apply generally to faith-based organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, again, I think it's two things. One, being firm in your mission and your values and not swaying to then have to either, get funding or get into a community. I think being brave enough to stick to your mission is really important, and being firm in what you believe in. And I also think, again, it's through that active listening and building partnerships. So specifically in Malawi, they have a chiefs ministry. So working with the chiefs, if the chiefs, believe, then the whole village kind of converts as well. And so it was, about building those allies and those partnerships in the community that would allow us to come in and help us kind of navigate some of those difficulties, because it's not a big Christian community in Malawi, but we were able to navigate some of that because we had active listening partnerships and we stuck to the Jesus part of our mission.
Now, I know the book is Sow, Grow, Lead, and we went into a lot of the sowing and some of the leading, but I didn't ask you much about the growing. And for organizations that are trying to figure out not only how to continue doing what they're doing, but to find the resources to sustain it. Can you talk a bit about what you did to generate the revenue you needed to do everything from take that rubble and build it into an actual factory to distributing content to all those things that require resources? Where did the resources come from?
So our goal the whole time was to be a social enterprise. And so we did want to sell our product to UNICEF, and to some nonprofit organizations. So establishing the social enterprise piece was essential for us, and that was one of my main goals, was to get us certified enough to be able to have that income coming in on that side. And then I think also, on the nonprofit side, especially international nonprofits, it can be hard to translate the story that you have on the field on the ground to those who haven't necessarily experienced it themselves. And so I think storytelling was a huge component of that, to engage individuals in the work that we were doing. And we also, when I was a part of it, I joined the Association of Fundraising Professionals, did their mentorship program, learned how to build out an annual and major gift program, which is stuff I still use today. But I think that's also an important piece of growing your fundraising, is identifying those people, individuals who will become your best ambassadors and advocates, identifying volunteers who can then, become your donors, and because they've been so involved in the organization, On the individual side, also reached out to different like Rotary clubs, the Barnabas group, philanthropic groups that had individuals within it. And that's how we were able to grow, because when we first started, it was like the 5 co-founders funding the organization, right? And then they got a little tired and wanted to, have their generosity still in the mission, but also, they had other priorities as well. As we all know, people give a lot of places. And so, yeah, I think just being clever on where you can find those individuals, having that great storytelling aspect as well.
Now, today, where are you with respect to this organization? Because you're also the savvy fundraiser. So, how does your life transition from the early days of PBJ to today?
That's a great question. And one I always like struggle to answer in like chronological order. But yeah, I was with PB&J for about 5 years, 5.5, and then I have since in between that and starting my own consulting group, I worked for a variety of nonprofits here in Orange County, California, mostly focused on human services and youth services. And I've worn all the hats, as most nonprofit professionals have. But today in 2022, I stepped out on my own, started the Savvy Fundraiser, and I really focus on fundraising strategy and building out that internal team alignment so that you can raise more revenue for your mission.
Right. And I know mission alignment's been kind of the thrust of this whole story. Thank you for this. How can people get your book? Is it available everywhere? Where do you recommend people look for it?
It is available on Amazon.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure to include that in the show notes as well. And in fact, I think that Jack, our producer, has already put it in the chat, but we'll make sure to put it in the show notes for the recording. Thank you so much, Haley. Really appreciate your sharing some of this about the book today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And now we're going to talk a little bit about an organization that you've heard plenty of in the news this week. For the On the Road segment, we're going to take a closer look at the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID or USAID, and why it's in the crosshairs of both President Trump and the entrepreneur Elon Musk. President Kennedy established USAID in 1961 to deliver foreign assistance, everything from fighting hunger to building infrastructure in developing nations at the height of the Cold War. Critics say it's an outdated relic, while supporters argue it remains crucial to countering Chinese and Russian influence abroad. And of course, many in our sector, in the nonprofit world, know it as both an organization that provides the funding we need in order to provide assistance around the world, as well as, of course, addressing major issues of health and development across the globe. Over the last 2 weeks, President Trump's administration has put dozens of USAID officials on leave, frozen billions in humanitarian aid, and even taken down the agency's website in the last 2 days. You may have seen people in Congress trying to enter the building just yesterday without success. It's a work in progress. This freeze has forced thousands of contractors out of work and shut down US-funded programs worldwide, perhaps even some of you, and left critics in Africa and migrant shelters in Latin America without critical support. The White House says now that this pause is part of a 90-day review to see which programs meet the administration's criteria of making America, quote, safer, stronger, or more prosperous. But with foreign aid accounting for less than 1% of the federal budget, even though on a global scale it's 42% of worldwide development assistance, and polls showing Americans generally overestimating those figures, many are watching closely to see whether this is a simple tightening of the belt or a fundamental shift in US global engagement. So today and On the Road, we want to take a closer look at the work of this imperiled agency with a short video provided by USAID itself through the Friends of USAID.
Our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Today, we seek to move beyond the accomplishments of the past, to establish the principle that all the people are entitled to a decent way of life.
Let us not forget that each child saved, each refugee housed, each disease prevented, each barrier to justice brought down, each sword turned into a plowshare brings us closer to peace, closer to freedom, closer to dignity.
America is a nation with a mission. And that mission comes from our most basic beliefs. Our aim is a democratic peace. A peace founded upon the dignity and rights of every man and woman.
We also know that progress in the most impoverished parts of our world enriches us all. So the United States will join with our allies to eradicate such extreme poverty in the next 2 decades by connecting more people to the global economy, by empowering women, by giving our young and brightest minds new opportunities to serve, and helping communities to feed, empower, and educate themselves. By saving the world's children from preventable deaths. That's how we'll confront the challenges of our time. This is how we will seize the promise of this moment in history. Who are we to believe that today's challenges cannot be overcome? When we've seen what changes the human spirit can bring. That is why we look to the future not with fear, but with hope.
Our thanks to USAID and the Friends of USAID for the video, and also to our friends at Arbor for helping us to convert that and share it with you. We want to thank the folks at Insightful who provided us access to much of the news that we reported today and are available to help you in tracking the news that's pertinent to your organization. And I want to encourage you to join us in the coming episodes ahead for some of the other things that you're going to see coming your way through the Philanthropy Mastermind series, including Josh Ligman of StoryRaise talking about the 6 steps for impact report success, enhancing retention and stewardship, coming up this Thursday in How to Raise, our CFRE accredited series, an interview with Sharice Harrison, President-elect of APRA, in our podcast, which you can find wherever you like to listen, or on the DonorSearch website, as well as the DonorSearch YouTube page. And you can, of course, sign up to receive other announcements about this series and all of our 3 different shows by simply going to the DonorSearch website and clicking at the top of the page to be on their list. You can also reach out directly to me anytime. My email address is j@donorsearch.net, or you can find me on LinkedIn to tell me what you'd like to see and hear in the weeks ahead. This show is built around you. So our thanks again to our DonorSearch, the help of our sponsor, DonorSearch, of course, to the other additional contributions made by everybody who's contributed to this program, including our 2 guests today. Thanks to our producer, Jack Frost. We look forward to seeing you next Tuesday on Frontlines. Until then, take care.